They have created a thoughtful strategy and a thoughtful approach to their application of military power that I think is lost on a lot of Western audiences.
Asymmetric warfare, which is the part of the doctrine and strategic culture of Iran, is a threat, real threat to our forces in the region. We need to be aware of that.
So the cyber capability of Iran is actually one of the areas that I think the U.S. should be concerned about.
This growth of their desire to influence the region through this approach through proxies and so on.
Enrichment capabilities. It's not just the nuclear program, it's the enrichment and heavy water reactors are main concerns.
The Iranian army would stand fast, defend Iran to its last bullet, its last breath.
I think it'd be very different in a very highly contested environment that would not be easily comparable to our experience in Iraq.
To understand their culture, the so-called strategic culture, that's what, in my opinion, is lacking in us.
So it's important, I think, to recognize that large segments of the Iranian population are just like you and I. They have the same, they're motivated by the same things, they have a lot of the same worldview.
The Iranian ability to build things, to make do with what they've got, and to build, reverse engineer and build their own versions of these things is phenomenal. They have developed a military-industrial complex that now builds its own tanks, builds its own armored personnel carriers, its own warships, frigates, and things like that, its own aircraft, helicopters, rockets, and obviously drones. It's important for the U.S. Army, for the people, the members of the U.S. Army, to be aware of the background of Persia or Iran, because the Iranians are. They have a very ancient civilization going back into the sort of prehistoric times. And most Iranians, whether they think in terms of their historical legacy or not, they live that historical legacy.
The importance of their Persian cultural heritage is more towards their, or is geared more towards how they see themselves within the region. Specifically, they have historical legitimacy within the region, and that's really where they fall back on that Persian heritage. Now, that has gone back and forth. Empires have risen and fallen since then with the introduction of Islam, and specifically Shia Islam, and then their Shia revolution. They see themselves more as Muslims than if you go back and look at their Persian heritage. But that is important for them to validate how they see themselves working within the region. The relationship between the U.S. and the Shah of Iran was a positive relationship in the U.S. eyes. They were a backstop during that time the Cold War was going on, having influence with the regional power, that we saw at that point, and oil-rich power as well. Having that influence with them in order to mitigate any sort of Soviet influence at the time was very important to us.
Influence of these clerics at the lower levels began to develop call it a counterlash, if you wish, which, moving us forward into the latter years of the 60s, is where Ayatollah Khomeini began to develop a following. He was a charismatic leader, a very effective speaker, and began to amass a following of folks who would listen to his sermons. And when he said, the Shah is undermining our traditions, the Shah is not being a good Iranian Muslim, began to get a lot of attention. So much so that the Shah eventually had him expelled from the country. Upshot of this whole thing is that the neighbor to the west, Saddam Hussein, decided that this time was right for him to launch an incursion to his east to seize Iranian terrain abutting the Shat al-Arab, which is the waterway that comes from the Persian Gulf and leads up to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So this is the beginning in 1980 of the Iran-Iraq War, which is another topic altogether. And oh, by the way, if you really want to get a little bit of a perspective on the devastation of the Iran-Iraq War, there are sources that would say that they lost 500,000 casualties or more.
After 1991, the Gulf War, they really started changing their outlook when they saw what a technologically advanced military could be possible of doing, especially to one of their countries right next door.
In my personal opinion, I still don't understand why we are approaching one size for all feet towards China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. It's clearly driving them towards each other, right? And that's a profound challenge would be potentially for our national security interests. Can we fight China and Russia at the same time? Or even Russia and Iran? If I was the king of the day, I would ensure that those adversaries are split.
Iran is continually looking for ways to exert its influence on a broader scale than just in the particular area of the Gulf. I think their intention to become part of this conglomerate we call BRIC is part of that. If the Iranian government can be recognized as being a contributing member of this group of second-level governments and economies, then it's all to their benefit.
I would agree with that. Probably that could be called like the club of sanctioned. So the several countries increasingly getting closer as partners, which historically be unfriendly to each other. But now they're getting closer to each other because your adversary is my adversary, and that's why we're friends.
I think we have to recognize that Iran, like every other country, doesn't do things that don't seem to support their national interests. So what is Iran's interest in joining BRIC? Diplomatic authority, economic connections, ability to evade some of the most egregious pieces of the sanctions, perhaps? Having a larger group speak in support of Iran's positions, all would be diplomatically beneficial, I think. If Iran were attacked from the outside, the Iranian army would stand fast, defend Iran to its last bullet, its last breath. Probably very effectively. They proved that in the Iran-Iraq War. Took them 8 years to go from being overwhelmed to being able to push the Iraqi army back into Iraq.
I would argue that the Iranian military is the first and probably best example of what we now call hybrid warfare. And this is something that goes straight back to the aftermath of the revolution. And really, when they were fighting the Iraqi military, which was a very, very powerful and well-equipped conventional force, the Iranians had to come up with new solutions to fighting this a much more capable conventional force. And the result is what we now call hybrid warfare.
Essentially, the Iranian military is made up of two major elements. The ارتش, which is the Iranian word for army, call them the conventional forces, which would be the Iranian land forces, the Iranian naval forces, the Iranian air forces, the Iranian rocket forces. These are the armor, the mechanized infantry folks, whose focus is national defense. The second group, you know as the Pasdaran, or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, is almost a mirror image, smaller, more ideologically focused than the ارتش. But the Pasdaran, or the IRGC, has a land force, a maritime force, an aerospace component, and the Quds Force, which is their special forces.
You have ارتش on one side, IRGC on the other. They both report to a single entity called the Armed Forces General Staff, which is the senior military element in Iran. That's the equivalent of their Joint Chiefs, basically.
Looking outside of Iran's borders, you have the IRGC Quds Force. They're the ones that go and help train their partners and allies, other military units, export Iranian ideology, as well as conduct military operations outside of those borders.
The IRGC, as it's developed, they continue to have the same central role, which is defending, protecting the revolution. That hasn't really changed. But as they've grown, as they've expanded, their role in Iran's military doctrine has changed significantly. And primarily, they've become the chief architect of Iran's regional force projection strategy. It took a while, and it took significant resources to build them into this new entity that really isn't like anything else in the world. The Artesh's mission is a much more conventional military mission. And primarily, their concern is the defense of Iranian territorial integrity. And they are built for that mission. It's a ground-heavy force. This is true for both ارتش and the IRGC. Their command structure is unique.
They have put a lot of effort into extending the reach of their missiles. They have short-range, long-range ballistic missile capability.
That has evolved now into one of the world's largest ballistic missile fleets. The unclassified numbers right now, I think, are over 3,000 missiles of all types in the Iranian inventory. And this is a way that they can affect a kinetic action hundreds or thousands of kilometers away from Iranian borders without having to send soldiers, aircraft, ships, the more conventional military forces.
Now, if you look at some of their asymmetric capabilities, if you look at drones, for instance, those are a lot of things that they're manufacturing themselves and increasingly adding on to their capability and how they interact. Are they able to swarm? What sort of payloads are they able to carry, et cetera. They're also looking at capabilities in that matter. If you look at unmanned water drones or underwater drones as well, versus focusing on, for instance, building an aircraft carrier or something like that when it comes to their maritime security.
Iranians excelled through their proxies, as well as electronic warfare, cyber, jamming certain signals, etc. That's what they excelled.
In 2020, they were successfully able to launch an attack against the Israelis' water infrastructure.
If they can attack any sort of opponent through the cyber warfare to stop them or to diminish their capability of impacting Iran, I think they'd see that as a success.
How do I assess the Iranian military capabilities? More than adequate to defend the nation.
I am 100% guilty of this. So I know that lots of my fellow military community is also. Is thinking of Iran as being primitive or unsophisticated when it comes to their military. Now, it is absolutely true that their military is not very modern, that it's relatively poorly equipped, relatively poorly trained, etc. Those things are all true. But their military thought is very sophisticated. It's something that in researching the ATP, I was struck by how consistent their thoughts were on their doctrine and how realistic they are in assessing their strengths and their weaknesses, in assessing their opponent's strengths and weaknesses, and coming up with a coherent strategy that accounts for all of that stuff. And they have created a thoughtful strategy and a thoughtful approach to their application of military power that I think is lost on a lot of Western audiences.
So Iran found ways to defeat a much more highly mechanized and armored military. Would they be able to do the same thing against a modern American force?
The most important thing that I think the U.S. Army needs to understand about Iran and any potential conflict that it might be involved in is to expect, or maybe not to expect, a conventional confrontation.
آنچه در مورد ما میگویند